After the Nazis were defeated, it became a very small world for them to hide in. Many ran away to South America, Argentina particularly, and interestingly enough, there were quite a few Nazis who hid within Germany itself. And it was a very, very real effort that the Shin Bet, the Israeli Secret Service, as well as, in fact, interesting enough, some of the German police forces began a manhunt for various individuals who were notorious Nazis. One person whose name was Kurt Franz, who was the commandant of the Treblinka concentration camp, was very, very much sought after. And his identification was known. They even found his place. They found the city, they found the block. There was a major manhunt, and eventually they tracked him down, and in fact they captured him. But what's amazing about the story is that the two individuals who actually broke into his apartment when he was out described the scene as they saw it. You see, that they captured this individual and he wasn't repentant, he didn't have charat, regret was not the shocking part. It's when they first walked into his apartment and they walked into his living room and they saw on the glass table a book. It was a scrapbook. And the scrapbook contained pictures of the concentration camps. And you'd see all the barbaric, horrific scenes of Jews being lined up and then being shot down. You'd see the barbed wires. In many of the pictures was Kurt Franz in his uniform, many of them standing proud, many of them smiling. You'd see the dead Jews, you'd see Kurt Franz. You'd see the Jews in fear, you'd see Kurt Franz. Picture after picture after picture. And the individuals who eventually arrested him said that that was not the frightening part. It was the front cover of this scrapbook. Because in German were written the words, "the best years of my life." This was 15 years after the war ended. And when you read a story like that, and you understand that there are people who don't just hate Jews, but vehemently, violently despise Jews, one of the questions that I think begs being asked is, "Sir, tell me why? Why? What's the problem? What's your beef?" And I dare say if you pressed a Kurt Franz against the wall, and if you hold him up against the wall and said, "What is your problem with the Jews?" I doubt he could answer. "I hate them. I know you hate them. But why? I drink them. I got that part. I got the pictures. I got the best years of my life. But why do you hate them?" And I'm willing to say that very, very few of modern anti-Semites would be able to express to you why it is that they hate the Jews. However, I believe that once upon a time, there were different sorts of anti-Semites. There were the type of anti-Semites who hated Jews with the same rabid intensity, but they could identify exactly and precisely why I hate those Jews. And I'd like to spend a little time this evening studying some of the events of the Megillah, and with an eye to see, number one, can we get a better perspective on this issue, get a broader view on the world, and get a very different understanding of life. And let me begin with one simple observation that's often missed. Purim is a very happy time. We celebrate, we have parties, we drink, but the reality is that Purim was slated to be a very different sort of event. Purim was slated to be the most serious Holocaust ever in the face of humanity. Lahashmid, laharug, la'abed, the entire Jewish nation was slated to be wiped out, annihilated, man, woman, and child in one day, and that was what was supposed to happen. That was what was decreed, and according to the normal path of life, the ways of nature, that's what should have happened. And I think when we get a look at the Megillah, and we get a look at some of the story, I think we're going to get a very different perspective on what it was like to be a Jew living in Shushan, and what it was like to be living in those times, and I think we'll have a very different understanding. And let me begin with one simple point. When we learn the story of the Megillah, typically we learn it on a very superficial, almost simplistic level. You know, there's this Achashverosh, he loves to party. He invites everybody to his big party. He invites his wife to come. How he invites her, I'm not sure, but he tells her to come in. She refuses. And because he's drunk, he asks his advisor, what do I do? His advisor, head of which is Haman, says, kill her. Oh, that sounds a good idea. Kills her. Wakes up the next morning. Where's Vashti? Oh, where is she? His advisor tell him, make a beauty pageant. He picks Esther. Along comes this Haman and says, you know, there's this nation you've probably never even heard of. You probably don't even know the name. Let's kill them. Okay, sounds good. He agrees to kill them. A little while later, Esther brings him to a party, tells him that my nation are being slaughtered. Oh my goodness, your nation? I didn't even know. At which point he says, who is it who devised this evil plan? He discovers that it's Haman. Categorically, that is not what happened. And if you study even a very simple reading of the Megillah, you'll quickly understand that there's a whole lot more going on beneath the surface. And let me begin with the most important point to understand. If you search the Megillah cover to cover, I challenge you to find me the name Hashem in that book. Rather strange. It's part of Tanakh, and in the entire Megillah, the name of God is not mentioned. And the reason for that really is twofold. Number one, because one of the great lessons of the Megillah is the fact that during this exile, there's a Hester Purim, Hashem is hidden. Hashem runs the world, Hashem orchestrates the events of this world, but hidden behind the scenes. But there's a particular reason why the name of Hashem was hidden, and that was because the authors of the Megillah were none other than Mordechai and Esther. But this Megillah was to be sent out to the entire, then most of the populated world, to the 127 Medinas, which were ruled by Achashverosh. And because this Megillah was to be disseminated throughout the world, it had to be politically correct. And what that means is the true villains, the true evil intents had to be masqueraded, had to be hidden. And if you study the Megillah, you'll find that there are many, many things that are written b'remiza, secretly, sort of hinting at, because this had to be read, this was to be looked at by not just Achashverosh, but every one of his henchmen and the entire populated world. Hence the story is hidden underneath. But let's see if we can begin uncovering a bit of the story of the Megillah to get a better understanding of what was actually happening. And we'll start with the very first pasuk. Remember when you were a little child, they taught you about Achashverosh, that roly-poly guy, loves to party, kind of like the Pillsbury Doughboy, pudgy guy, gets drunk at the party. And says Rashi, make no mistake, who Achashverosh means, who berisho mitchilosav ad sofo, he was in his wickedness from the beginning to the end. Do not assume that he was some nilly-willy kind of guy who didn't quite get the program. He was wicked from the opening bell to the last round. He was wicked through and through. In fact, the Ibn Ezra explains one of the reasons why he made this party. Makes this big party, 180 days, and then another 7 days, says the Ibn Ezra, because he was making a calculation. That calculation was that the 70 years were up. You see, all of the monarchs of the world counted the 70 years that Yirmiyah HaNavi said would mark the exile. Remember, this is the first base of Mikdash is destroyed. We're sent into exile. And Yirmiyah tells us before we go out, we'll be in exile for 70 years. The question is, when do you count those 70 years? Achashverosh counted, realized the 70 years were up. Since they were up and the Jewish people were not saved, he makes a party. Why a party? Because, wow, that's it. I got them. I get to keep them. They will never be redeemed. However, that's just scratching the surface. Because the Nesivos says there's another little part of this pasuk that's not quite as obvious. And that is that the pasuk tells us that he rules over 127 medinos, 127 city-states. But the Nesivos makes a very important point. He says this was not the sum total of the world. As a matter of fact, there were another 113 states that he didn't rule over. However, he once did. As a matter of fact, the Gemara tells us that there were 4 people in history who were supposed to rule over Kippa. Kippa means the globe, the entire populated world. Once upon a time, Achashverosh was one of those 4 men. He had, at a certain point, ruled over not just 127, but 127 and 113. He was emperor of the world. And by all stretch of the imagination, at this point, this should have been the low point of his monarchy, because he had just recently lost 113 Medinos. He just recently had the rebellion, just recently things were solidified, and almost half of his rulership was gone, and he should have been depressed, he should have been broken, he should have been eulogizing, and instead he makes a mishteh, he makes a party. And the Nesivos explains why he makes his party. Achashverosh took this as a sign from heaven. You see, we, the Jewish people, are always exiled across the 4 corners of the earth. And the Gemara tells us that that's a special mercy that Hashem has upon us, so that if we're in one area and an evil despot, an evil king rises up to kill us, he may destroy part of the nation, but there'll be a Shevis, a Plato, there'll be another part of the nation alive in another dynasty, another monarchy. Therefore Hashem always spreads this out throughout the globe. However, when Achashverosh ruled over the entire earth, clearly we were under one king's rulership. He ruled the earth. Interestingly enough, when half of his malucha, half of his kingdom was taken away, he still had every single Jew alive under his dominion. As a matter of fact, you could almost tell which city-state would be taken and which would remain. If there were Jews in that area, it remained with him. If there were no Jews, it was taken, and it was like a laser was cutting out his border. The criteria was, if there were Jews who lived in that region, it remained under his dominion. If there were no Jews, it was taken away. And when the rebellion was done, when he now only ruled over half of the earth, every single Jew alive was under his rulership, and he took that as a sign, min hashamayim, he took that as a sign from heaven, that the Jewish people were being delivered into his hands to annihilate, to murder, and says in the Sivas, therefore he made a party. He made a mishteh, because wow, this great accomplishment. I get to finally end this Jewish race. I get to finally kill them. And despite the fact that he had lost half of his kingdom, despite the fact that he went from being emperor of the earth to now ruling but half of it, he should have been depressed, but he wasn't depressed, he was happy. And my friends, I'd like you to keep in mind that Achashverosh was not born into kingdom. He was not born a melech. He scratched, clawed, fought his way into power. He was an extraordinarily ambitious, very driven individual. And when he lost power, it hurt him and pained him. But there was a conciliation. There was something that was so beautiful, so touching to his soul. The fact that he gets to kill these Jews, that it was worth it. It didn't matter. And he was besimcha. But you have to understand there's a few more steps to the story. You see, Achashverosh was a bit of a student of history. Belshazzar had made a grievous error. Belshazzar, who was the king of the nobility in the Roman dynasty, the Bavel dynasty, made a very serious error. He counted the years that Yirmiyah said would be the 70 years. He counted from the wrong point. And he reached a certain time period where, according to his cheshbon, his calculation, the 70 years that the Jews were to be redeemed had passed. And right around that time period, he was fighting a major war. The Bavel dynasty was fighting against Paras Umadai. His enemies had been destroyed, and he took it as a sign that he was to become emperor of the earth. He was to win, and the Jews would not be delivered. And at that party, he made a very foolish error. He took the kalim from the Beis Hamikdash, the golden vessels. He took the begodim, the cloak of the Kohen Gadol. He put on the cloak, and put on the tzitz. He walked into this party wearing all of the begodim, all of the clothes of the high priest, and he sits down at this party. All of his nobles were gathered. They begin drinking, and at a certain point there's a hush in the room. because someone noticed that there was an apparition, there was an image. A hand, literally a hand, began writing on the wall. You know that expression, you could see the hand writing on the wall? The Navi tells us there was a hand, a large hand, that was holding a quill, and it was writing words on the wall. And the words that it wrote were, Minei, Minei, Tekal, Uparse. 4 words that were in Hebrew letters, Aramaic words in Hebrew letters, but he couldn't read them because it was Hebrew letters. He didn't know what it meant. All of his advisors couldn't read it. They quickly called for Daniel, who was an advisor to the king, and he asked Daniel, what does this mean? And Daniel read the words, Minei, Minei, Tekal, Uparse, weighed, weighed, measured, and torn. Your actions have been weighed, they've been measured, your kingdom will be torn from you, it is over. That evening, Paras Umadai's troops fought back, the Bavel dynasty was killed out, every man, woman, and child in his kingdom, in Belshazzar's royal kingdom, was killed out, with the exception of one young woman whose name was Vashti. That Vashti becomes the queen of Achashverosh. Achashverosh marries Vashti for 2 reasons. Number 1, she was an extremely beautiful woman. Number 2, she was the one who legally owned the throne. By marrying this woman, what Achashverosh was doing was solidifying his power base. Now he wasn't just the monarch of Paras Umadai, his actual dynasty, but he was marrying into the Bavel dynasty, solidifying his power base, and this was a major step forward. And interestingly enough, he too did something at this party. He too counted the years, and he said Belshazzar counted and was in error. Belshazzar counted the 70 years totally incorrectly. However, I counted the 70 years and I got them right, and the Jews have not been redeemed, therefore they will not be redeemed, and therefore at this party he brings out the Kalim. And if you listen to the pasuk says, Vashkok b'klei zahav v'chelim mechelim shonim. We read that pasuk in the Trop of the Eicha. Unusual Kalim were brought out. Those were the Kalim of the Beis Hamikdash. They were used at his party, and because of that same error that Belshazzar made, it was decreed that his wife was to die, and that's why Vashti was killed at this very party that he made, according to some, actually his wedding party when he married Vashti. But here's a very interesting point to understand. The Megillas Esther, written by the Nesivos, asks a very important point. He says, why do we need to know all of the details of this party? Okay, he makes a party, it's nice. Why do we have to know all the details, that type of seats they sat on, what the tapestries were made of, what they drank on this party? Why do we, thousands of years later, need the details? Explains the Megillas Esther that the details are very significant. Because Achashverosh had a particular point in mind in this party. You see, the regular party was to show his wealth. The 180 days was to show the world his glory, his majesty, who he was. But the real focus of the party was the last 7 days. The last 7 days was when he invited the people of Shushan to his party. Who were the people of Shushan? The Jews who were exiled primarily lived around that area. We'd call it like the borough park of Paras Umadai. The Sanhedrin lived there. Most of the Jews lived there. Shushan was the seat of what was remaining of Torah loyal Jews. And when he invited those people to the party, it was not because he was welcoming friends, it was because he was attempting to trip them up. And then Nesivos explains step by step what his intentions were. You see, he laid out this huge, beautiful party. But each step was carefully made to allow the Jews to have free will, whether to indulge or whether not. At this party you ate exactly what you wanted. If you wanted glat kosher shchita, you got to ask for that. If you wanted to eat pork fried exactly as you wished, that's what you asked. Each person got exactly what they wanted, because as the pasuk says, "Lasos kiritzon ish v'ish," to do the ratzon of each man, you got exactly what you wanted. At this party, he laid out many, many various temptations to get the Jewish people to sin. There were many, many very attractive women, or prostitutes. He realized the Chachamim would never look. They wouldn't be involved, they wouldn't even look. He laid out ornate tapestries with a particular intention. They'll look at these very sophisticated tapestries. When they look up, maybe they'll see something, maybe they'll think incorrect thoughts. He was very sophisticated. But not just that. Who was one of the wealthiest men in Paras Hamadai? Interestingly enough, there was a particular minhag of old in Paras Hamadai, and that is when you came to a party, you had to drain the goblet. They sit around this very large goblet, and every person at the party had to drink it to the bottom. The Sar HaMashke, the person who would bring it around, was one of the wealthiest people in Paras Hamadai. Why? Because let's assume you were a little bit sensitive to wine. Let's assume you got headaches, you weren't interested in the hangover. What would happen is when the Sar HaMashke would bring by the cup, you'd slip him a 20, I don't know what the currency was, 100 or 1,000, and at which point he would pass you by. But at this particular party, Ashtiyak Kedas Einones, there was no one forced to drink from the goblet. Why? Because Achashverosh knew that if they were drunk, if they were intoxicated, they wouldn't be chayiv. They'd have an excuse, and therefore the Shtiyah was Kedas, no one was forced to drink. And now, my friends, I'd like to share with you the Gemara that explains to us the famous conversation between Haman and Achashverosh. A few years later, Haman says, and there's this little nation that no one ever heard of. Let me kill them out. Says the Gemara, that is patently false. That was not the conversation. As a matter of fact, says the Gemara, if you'd like to know what that conversation really entailed, imagine the following. Imagine there are two neighbors with adjoining fields. One man has in his field a very deep, large ditch. One man next to him has in his field a very large pile of dirt. The man with the ditch says to the man with the pile, I can't plow my field. I have this large ditch. Can I please take your dirt? I'll gladly pay you for it. It'll fill in my ditch and I'll be able to plow. The man with the mound says, pay me? I can't plow my field because I have this large mound of dirt. Take it for free. We'll both benefit. Not a problem. Says the Gemara, that was Haman and Achashverosh. When Haman came to Achashverosh and said, let's kill the Jews, Achashverosh says, I would love to do it. I've been dreaming of doing it for years, but forget about it. I see what happened to Belshazzar. I see what happened to every king who began with them earlier. I'm not doing it. Count me out. And after pleading and pleading, attempt after attempt, Haman finally won, because as the Gemara says, there were very few people who knew to speak Lashon Hara like Haman, because listen to the words he said. Yeshno am echad. Not that there is one nation. Yishanu min ha-mitzvahs. They're sleeping from the mitzvahs. You're afraid to touch the Jewish people because they're holy. You're afraid to touch them because God protects them. They're sleeping. And if you tell me, but they have the Chachamim, the great Torah sages, their merit will protect them. Am echad, they're one nation. If the tail has sunken that low, the head can't be that much higher. Yeshno am echad, mefuzah, mefurad. They're spread out. They're ineffective. God will no longer protect them. Once Haman said those words, what did Achashverosh say? HaKesev nasullah, keep the money. Why did he say keep the money? Do you know what the money was? 10,000 talents. A talent is about 100 pounds of silver. The spot price of silver, anybody in silver, is probably, I don't know, $20 an ounce or so. Somewhere in the vicinity of $3 billion. Nah, keep the money. What do you mean keep the money? You know why I keep the money? Because I don't need the money. If you're going to kill them, you have my blessings, you have my bracha, I'll pay you to do it. They were equal villains. They were willing partners. Achashverosh didn't need to be convinced. He said, keep the money, and he took the signet ring and gave it to Haman and said, take the nation, do with them as you wish to. And interestingly enough, the Targum Sheni explains to us that when the Jewish people found out about this decree, it was a bit different than we normally assume. You see, in those days, there was no internet, there were no faxes. How did you get the message out there? In each town, there was a center part of town, there was a court. In the middle of the court was a sort of like a tree. on that tree, on that post, the king's decrees would be nailed up. And in each town, in each of the Medinas, in each of the city-states was nailed up the following decree, which a Targum Sheni translates, and I'll translate it for you approximately in English. It read something like this. It should be known to you that a man has come to join us to help fight our enemies. His name is Haman, the son of Agag, the son of the great Amalek, a man of great wealth. He asked me a small question. He told me about the Jews, how unimportant they are, how little they contribute to us, and they are not worth anything. He asked that we annihilate this people, and he offered to pay me a great sum. I took the money and agreed. You see, he lied in that Igeris. He assumed that no one would believe him if he said that he didn't take the bribe. I took the money and agreed. So therefore, eat, drink, and be merry, for that is what I, your king, am doing. On the 13th of Adar, every man should grab his sword and bow, go out and kill this nation. Do not have mercy upon them, not on the princes, not on their women, not on the babies. For me, your king Achashverosh, I'm doing as such. And here's the punchline. Any city, town, or family in which a Jew is found will be killed themselves. Signed, your king Achashverosh. The Targum Sheni explains that when the Jews read this Igeris, they knew it was over. You see, Achashverosh was a very, very powerful king. He ruled with an iron fist. And when he signed that Igeris, that decree with the words that any town in which a Jew would be found, the town would be annihilated. Any family in which a Jew was hidden, that family would be annihilated. Every person in Purim and Madai knew that he fully intended to fulfill that decree. And the Jewish people knew that it was over. There was nowhere to hide. You couldn't go to your loyal neighbor and say, please, we've been friends for 20 years. Please hide me in your basement. Because the man would say, are you crazy? This man is a vicious king. He's a murderous king. Anyone knows that if you walk into his throne room without being invited, Achaz Dasul Lahamis just slaughtered on the spot. As a matter of fact, if you'd like to know how barbaric he was, the Gemara tells us that when Esther finally comes into the king's throne room, the queen, wearing the royal garments, wearing the crown of the queen, she walks in, his two guards run out to slaughter her on the spot, because that was a standard procedure. If you walked into Achashverosh's throne room without a royal invitation, you were killed. It didn't matter who you were. He was a barbaric individual, and everyone knew that the lives of the Jews were over. There was no hope. There was no going back. Now, that being said, you'd imagine that the Jews in Shushan, the Jews in Paras and Madai took this very seriously. But if it wasn't quite serious enough, there's one more step that the Megillah tells us to let us know quite how severe the situation was. The pasuk in Perek Daled begins, Mordechai yadda es kol asher nasa. Mordechai knew all that was done. The Gemara brings down the Targum. It says to us as follows. What do you mean Mordechai knew all that was done? It says the Targum, it doesn't mean that Esther told Mordechai. It doesn't mean Haman told Mordechai. Who told Mordechai? Eliyahu Hanovi told Mordechai as follows. This decree was not written by Achashverosh. It was not signed with a signet ring, nor was it even written by Haman. This decree was written in a Shemayim, was written by Hashem, because the Jews were not where they should have been, and therefore the Jews were deserving of destruction. Mordechai Yadav Sadavar means Mordechai knew that the decree was from heaven. From heaven they decided that the Jewish nation should no longer exist. When Mordechai told over those words to the Jewish people, you had better believe that we got it. And we understood the gravity of the situation, and we understood that there was no hope. Yet amazingly, very shortly thereafter, Esther tells Mordechai something. Mordechai says something very interesting in reaction, and if you think about it, it's a pella. Esther says to Mordechai as follows, I will go into the king. I'll beseech mercy. However, sumu alai, fast 3 days. Laila v'yom. 3 days and 3 nights. The very next pasuk says, Vayavor Mordechai. Mordechai passes. What does that mean? Rashi explains that Mordechai decided to, pass over, meaning he passed against the religion. You see, that day that the decree was made was the 13th of Nisan. The next day was when Esther told Mordechai what to do. Mordechai then decreed that the following day should be a fast day. Well, the following day was Tes Vov Nisan, which is the first day of Pesach. Vayavor Mordechai means he undid a mitzvah. There was a mitzvah in the Torah to eat matzah. There's mitzvahs that are abundant to drink 4 cups of wine. There's mitzvahs to eat maror. All of the mitzvahs of Pesach he annulled. Vayavor he got rid of. And the question is, and this is a very key point, my friends, why did Mordechai do that? If you and I were in this situation, I think what we'd quickly realize is that the Jewish nation is in big trouble. But the Jewish nation is not in big trouble simply because Haman is an enemy of the Jews, nor because Achashverosh is a mighty, powerful dictator. But the Jewish people are in trouble because Hashem is angry with the Jewish people. So what does Mordechai do? He says, what I want you to do is obliterate the mitzvahs of Pesach. Forget them, destroy them, get rid of them. Let's fast for the next 3 days. Now, if Mordechai was thinking with our thought process, I think what he would do is simply wait. Meaning, keep the mitzvahs of Pesach. Keep the mitzvahs of matzah, dalet kosas. That's a schus, that's a merit. Decree the fast day 1 day later, so we'll have additional merits. We'll have the merits of eating matzah. We'll have the merit of telling the Seder properly. Decree the fast 1 day later. And if you don't quite hear this as a question, let's understand the chronology. The decree was not to kill the Jews 2 days from now, nor 5 days from now, nor 10 days from now. The decree which was made in Nisan was to kill the Jews on Yud Gimel Adar, 11 months later. There was plenty and plenty of time for there to be a fast, plenty and plenty of time for Esther to go in, and yet Mordechai felt that he's going to take away the mitzvahs of Pesach, eliminate dalet kosas, eliminate matzah. We have to act on it right now. And the question that I'd like to focus on this evening is, why did Mordechai feel that it's so significant for him to eliminate the mitzvahs of Pesach when it would have been a lot more sensible for him to keep those mitzvahs, use those extra merits, and have the fast 1 day later, 2 days later, a week later, 2 weeks later, but keep Pesach and then keep the fast? And I'd like to take a break from the story of the Megillah to answer this question. And to take that break, let me share with you something I find very interesting. I deal with a population, primarily young men who are in the working force. And oftentimes the question comes up, what should I do for a living? This type of career, this industry, this business. So I have the following observation that I think bears thinking about. If you'd like to go into business and do well, I have a simple suggestion. Find yourself in any business that's doing somewhere around, let's say, $500 million a year in sales. Own that business and you'll earn a nice living. I think most people agree that that's a decent way to earn a living, owning a $500 million company. Now, the reason I say that is because Harvey Mackay, the author of Swim in the Sharks, owns such a company. He began the Mackay Envelope Company, built it up to be a $500 million company, and much of the book that he wrote describes some of the winnings of being a very, very rich individual. In this book, when he describes a lot of business acumen, he also describes some of the things that come along with wealth. Some of the things that you get to buy. You get to buy the BMWs in every flavor of the rainbow. You get to buy every imaginable type of toy and whatever you could ever dream of. But he explains that at a certain point, you run out of things to buy. You bought it, you own it, now what? So you get another one, another color, but it runs out. So he explains that when you get to a certain point of wealth, what you really covet, when you really want to make it big, is when you could buy a professional sports team. And he describes that some of his buddies actually own sports teams. For years and years he's been dreaming of owning his own team. He's not quite gotten there, but that's the dream of a very wealthy man, to own his own professional sports team. Okay. The reason why that's very interesting is because, as you may know, a number of years ago, Microsoft was in a bad position. You see, they were spinning off cash. They had excess cash that they didn't have anything to do with. There was nothing in terms of research and development that they could further fund. They didn't need this money for marketing. And they were spinning off such profits that it was really looking bad. You see, investors don't like to see that. The market doesn't like to see that you have so much cash that you can't use it because it doesn't look good. The problem was that they had at the time excess cash in the tune of $40 billion. If you'd like to know how much money that is, that's enough money to buy every sports team in every league in the United States of America. The chairman of the board is a gentleman named Bill Gates. Bill Gates, according to many standards, did pretty good. College dropout, never can enough. It's like, poor guy, parents sitting, hey, I got a little boy, he didn't even graduate college, but he did all right for himself. In other words, despite not graduating college, he did okay. Now, with his success also comes an interesting position, and that is he has a very real sense of humility. He was once on the Larry King show, and Larry King was looking to dig for the dirt. So what does Larry King do? Larry King starts asking him, so tell me, Bill, what's the secret to your success? How did you make it? How did you really succeed? So he says as follows, Larry, you got to understand, I was in the right place at the right time, and luck has a lot to do with it. Humble statement. But then he continues. He goes on, but Larry, you should know, there were many people also who were in the same place, but they didn't succeed. You see, what I had vision. I had a vision of what could be. But then he goes on. But Larry, there were many people who had luck and had vision, but they still didn't make it. Would you like to know why I succeeded? He says it was because I took massive and immediate action. And when you study history, what you find is that oftentimes highly successful people are at the right place, the right time, they have the vision, but the key is that they take massive and immediate action. They see that opportunity and they jump on that opportunity. They move with both feet and they let nothing stand in their way. And you could have a lot of talent, you could be in the right place, you could have the vision, but if you don't have that drive, if you don't step forward and jump on that opportunity and take massive and immediate action, the greatest luck, the greatest vision is going to be useless. And invariably, when you find people who reach very, very real levels and great heights, they had the luck, they had the opportunity, but they took massive and immediate action. And oftentimes, you'll find people who accomplish very little because they don't take that huge step forward and move on it. My friends, if you'd like to learn a lesson from the Megillah, I think there's one huge key understanding. You see, Mordechai looked at this situation and understood it was a dire, dire situation. He understood that the Jewish people were in desperate straits. And he understood that the only hope was a total reversal, not a reversal of Achashverosh's mind, not a reversal of Haman's intentions, a reversal of the state of the Jewish nation. He understood that the Jews had to do tshuva, and the only hope was for massive and immediate action. You see, he knew that when the Jews read that Igeris, when they stood at the base of that edict and they read the words and they knew it was over, there was a sudden urgency. There was a tremendous move right then, and they felt it. And Mordechai also knew that if he waited a day, surely if he waited a week, that sense of impending urgency, that sense of drama would have been lost. If he didn't take massive and immediate action right now, if he didn't move on it, the moment would have been lost. And at that point, he seized the moment, despite the fact that the next day was Pesach. He said, we're going to decree a fast tomorrow. Not in 2 days, not a week from now, but immediately, because there was a drive, there was an energy. They felt that desperation, and he knew he had to move on it. And in fact, that decision changed the course of history. At that point, the tzaddik of the generation, Mordechai, who was the Rosh Sanhedrin, sat down in the courtyard of Shushan. It was a huge, huge area, and the Jews began gathering, and they began gathering by the thousands. The Medrash, the Tanchumas, tells us that there were 12,000 Kohanim. 12,000 Kohanim who came, each one holding a Sefer Torah and blowing shofars, and this was arguably the greatest tshuva rally ever imaginable. And within 3 days, the Jewish nation changed who they were. They went from point A to point B, and their tshuva was accepted. And in that moment, in that short time, the reversal of history was brought about. But it only happened because Mordechai understood that the intensity of the moment had to be grabbed, and you have to seize the moment. And he knew that had he allowed a little bit of time to pass, it would have lost the intensity, would have lost that sense of urgency, and the events would have been different. And this concept, my friends, I believe has an awful lot of meaning to us. There are many, many lessons to learn from the Megillah. The first lesson to understand is that anti-Semitism is not something new to us. But not only is it not something new, the anti-Semites of modern eras are a bit shallow in their vision. You see, the anti-Semites of yore, of yesterday, understood why it is that they hated a Jew. And the reason was quite simple. You see, when Achashverosh saw a Jew, he saw an Eved Hashem, he saw a representative of God, and he saw that as an enemy that he was pitched against. You know what the Alshich explains? The Alshich explains, when you read the story in Chumash about building the Tower of Bavel. How do you read that as a kid? So the people on the earth wanted to fight God. So you built a tower. I mean, we're going to box God. God's up in heaven. We'll build a big tower. Come on, God, let's fight it out. It says Al-Shech, that's juvenile. Would you like to know what the people in that generation were doing? They understood that there is a city, the most holy city in the world, called Yerushalayim. Opposite that city, they were trying to build a place of Tumah, a place of the opposite of holiness. They understood that there was one place in that city that was to be the holiest place, that was to be the Beis HaMikdash. Opposite that, they were trying to build a tower. They were being mashrish Tumah. They were putting roots to Tumah. It's hard for us, with all our sophistication, to understand, but these people were steeped in a very different type of understanding. They understood holiness, they understood its opposite, and the Alshich explains that what Achashverosh did when he built Shushan was he was building a city, a fortress of Tumah. He was standing up against God, not because God was some evil force, but he was standing up against God because God, the Jews, represented holiness, and he was fighting against that. And the reason why he hated the Jew was because the Jew represented holiness, the Jew represented Torah, and everything that he did was fighting against that. Those were anti-Semites of yesteryear. And that battle was fought by a Mordechai because he understood the issues there. We live in rather ironic times. The land we right now sit in is free, and we're able to walk as Jews without fear, without much trouble. And yet we constantly read about our nation and our people being destroyed. Shiva, one of the greatest yeshivas, a Mekaz Harav, which is a Mokum of Kedusha, was just attacked. And it's a very interesting thing to note that Western man has trouble dealing with the whole issue. You see, it's not just Western man, but most Israelis who are not religious cannot understand the why. What is their problem? Why do they hate us? Why are they so bothered by our existence? And the answer has to be that we've done something wrong to them. We've oppressed them. We've tortured them. We've obviously killed them in some major way. And the problem is that when you study even recent history, you see that nowhere in the Arab world does any Arab have the rights that he has in Israel. Nowhere in the Arab world do the Palestinian have the opportunity that he has in Israel. There are universities, there are jobs, there's even no other nation on the face of the planet could ever dream this. Our enemies are Chavre Knesset. Could be an Arab, be a member of the Knesset, and there are Arab members of Knesset within the democracy called Israel. An Arab can have and does have every right except for one: please do not kill, murder Jews. That's the only request. and there is some oppression for which they hate us. And it's very difficult from a non-religious standpoint to understand what is your beef, what is your problem. And I'd like to share with you something that I think is very interesting, because when you read it on CNN, when you read it again from a very, very secular vantage point, you have to sort of take a step back and think a bit. Rim el-Riashi became the first woman terrorist who, with permission, with acknowledgement of a known Islamic group, blew herself up. This was something that was very unusual, because for a woman to become a martyr, you got to be a man, a woman. That's why, how could a woman, a lowly woman, should be a martyr? She was the first woman who became a martyr, and on January 14th, 2004, at the main crossing between Israel and the Gaza Strip, she blew herself up, killing 4 people and injuring 7. Okay. The interesting part is that immediately after she blew herself up, they showed the graphic video that she had taped a few days before. And you see her wearing her khakis, her green army uniform, holding a high-powered rifle. And these are the words that she says. They were translated into English, approximately as follows. By God, my heart is full of many mixed feelings. I cannot control them, as though a single thought is gripping my mind. My heart beats and says, God, make me a martyr for your sake. I've always wished and went too far in wishing that my body would be shrapnel that tears the sons of Zion. I've always wished to knock at the door of heaven with the skulls of the sons of Zion. By God, if you break my bones and cut off my body, you will not be able to change my faith or change my banner. This is my conviction. I began to do the utmost since 2nd grade. I searched on a daily and continuous basis in the hope of finding someone who would guide me or help me in becoming a martyr. And by God, I'm finally being there. I'm finally the first female who will be able to carry out a martyrdom-seeking operation in Israel. I wish my body to be scattered in the air to fulfill your wishes. These were the words of a mother of a 3-year-old boy and a 1-year-old girl. That was in 2004. If you listen to the Shmuz very recently, I mentioned the fact that her daughter is a bit older now. And her daughter was recently videotaped. Her daughter, who's now, I believe, 4 or 5 years old, was videotaped. And it's a beautiful, haunting song. It begins with a song, Where is Mommy? And you see this little girl looking around, and her brother and her are wishing they could see Mommy, and they don't see Mommy anymore. And then you see an image of a woman, and you see the explosives around her stomach, and you see an image of her leaving the house late at night, and you begin to cry because you realize what these people are doing to little children, their own mother. And then the song continues, Mommy, I miss you. Mommy, I want to join you. And then you see the little girl reach into the drawer, take out her own explosives, put them under her shirt, and go out into the street. Mommy, I'm going to join you. Mommy, I too wish to be like you. And then you understand that this people is a bit different than the common Western man. And my friends, there is one moral to the story. The moral of the story is, if you will search under the entire secular globe, if you will